So I was very much immersed in multiple cultures, multiple languages, multiple people from all over the world. And so I just started learning about my own Jewish faith in my late 20s. And I never really knew anything about death or the afterlife. It's not something I went to school to learn about. I kind of fell into it. Basically, what happened was, as I was learning more about my Jewish heritage, I was with a friend, I was with a girlfriend at her house, and she got a phone call and she said, I need a fourth person. Can you help me out with a very special mitzvah? And I'm like, sure, whatever. So we get in the car and I said, okay, what are we going to go do? And she says, well, we're going to go prepare a lady to be buried. And I said, what? I'd never done that before. I never even heard of it. Never heard of this concept that this even happens. And I was frightened, a little bit nervous of, as you can imagine. I said, I don't know what I'm going to be doing. And she said, don't worry, I'll show you. I'll explain to you what we're going to be doing. And when I walked into the room, I felt this incredible sense of holiness and calmness, and you could feel the sense of seriousness of this whole thing. There's no talking. Women take care of women, men take care of men, and it's very modest, very holy. The only talking is anything related to the preparation of the person, and some prayers that are said. Tehillim is said, and you can feel the soul sort of hovering. And that's our Jewish concept. We understand it this way, that the soul knows and is very aware of what's happening. So that's how I got into this. I sort of fell into it, and it was such a holy and beautiful experience that I decided that I wanted to continue to do this mitzvah. And then over the years, various things came up, various, miracle stories that happened in my own life and other people's life, that I decided to get way more involved. And now I help people on a regular basis worldwide with helping them in crisis situations get buried, how to deal with mourning, how to deal with loss. So I've written several books on it, and I have a curriculum for children in schools as well. So that's kind of how I fell into this. Now I want to tell you a little bit about the journey of the soul. So I mentioned the tahara, that's called the preparing the person for burial. The soul knows, it separates from the body. We are essentially a soul. We're not a body having a sort of a Jewish experience. We're a soul in a body having our life here. And when the person passes away, the soul separates from the body, and it's aware. It can see, it can feel, hear, in those kind of terms. I mean, obviously don't have eyes and hands and such, but it can sense everything that's going on. And so in the very beginning, there's a confusion, because the soul has lived in the body for, all these years. And so there's a confusion. And the reason we want to bury someone as quickly as possible is because, imagine you're going on a trip, let's say to a nice trip. We can't travel right now, but let's imagine that you could go on a trip. You want to get to the airport as quickly as possible and have your amazing trip. And so that's the same thing it is for the soul. The soul wants to hurry up and get to God. And so that's why our Jewish faith believes in having a burial as quickly as possible. And once the body is in the ground, then the soul can feel at rest and go on its journey. So it might sound very strange, but the soul is made up of multiple parts. So the cemetery itself is called a Beis Chaim, and in Hebrew that means the home of the living. So why would a cemetery, the place that we put our departed loved ones, why would that be called the home of the living in Hebrew? The reason is because we believe that part of the soul hovers or rests at the gravesite forever. And that's why it's part of our tradition to visit cemeteries of our loved ones, even famous cemeteries. There's cemeteries all over Europe people go to visit and pay respects. There's cemeteries in Israel. I mean, we can even go visit the place of burial for Abraham and Sarah, the place of burial of Rachel, one of our foremothers, and so many others. And so we believe that there's this concept that part of the soul, after the body is buried, remains at the cemetery. And that's why it's customary to go to the cemetery and visit. and place a stone to say that you were there and to pray. You're not praying to the departed loved one, but it's a holy place. And so your prayers and your thoughts can be elevated by the departed person, and their soul goes up and pleads on your behalf to God. So that's one of the reasons why we go to visit a cemetery. Um, and the other thing about the soul, right away after it's buried, it can hear what's going on at the funeral. And then at Shiva, we have this beautiful custom of that our rabbis gave us over the centuries and years, is to sit Shiva. And there's a reason for that. We need to go through a process, and the soul actually is at the Shiva house. Now, you might have multiple Shiva houses. You might have people in different countries, different cities, but the soul actually is there as well, because the soul is also mourning the loss of being here. It's not just us that are mourning the loss of that physical connection with our departed loved one, but the soul is mourning it too. And so when we go to a Shiva house, multiple Shiva houses, the soul is in each of those places. We don't understand it because we can't see it, but there are many stories of people who can feel it and have had, interactions. So after the Shiva, the soul goes up to a place where it's called Gehenna. Now, it's not the Christian version of, pitchforks and devils and things, but it's a place where, let's say you broke your arm, God forbid, or, you had an illness and you need to get fixed, right? So you go to a hospital. You go to hospital to get, your arm put in a cast. So it's the same thing for the soul. The soul needs a sort of a cleansing for the mistakes that it might have made in its life. And that's what Gehenna is. It's a sort of a hospital for the soul. And the reason that we say Kaddish, which is a very special prayer that's said once someone has passed away, we say this prayer for 11 months, because the maximum amount of time that a soul would be in this place for cleansing is 11 months. A soul could be there for a second. A soul could be there for a very short time. But we customarily say the Kaddish prayer for 11 months. And then once a year is the yahrzeit. Now, the yahrzeit means the anniversary of someone's passing. And that's also a special time to say prayers and do good deeds. So one of the things that happens with the soul is that it goes up after that point to heaven. And what can we do to maintain the spiritual connection, right? What can we do for our loved ones over time to move them up in the heavenly abode? The concept is, for example, like a soul. Let's say if you can imagine a theater, and in the center, in the center is God, and there's all the souls there, and they are getting closer and closer to God. So the mitzvahs that we do here on this earth help the soul move closer and closer to God, move up. And so that's how you can maintain a spiritual connection with your departed loved ones. And there's many different things that you can do. I'll just mention, a few, but some of the things that you can do to maintain a spiritual connection with your departed loved ones is you can learn Torah in their memory. You can name a baby after someone who's passed. You can give charity, tzedakah dollars. There's so many different things. You can set up a Hesed organization, but a child who's lost a parent, whatever they do, it brings merit to the parents automatically. For myself, for example, like my uncle who just passed, what I would do is I would say his name, and I would say, I'm giving this charity dollar in the memory of my uncle. And I'd say his name because he's not a first degree relative, but for a first degree relative, like a mother and a father, all the good deeds that you do are good for the soul and maintains that spiritual connection. Because even though we can't hug and we can't touch our departed loved one, we can still send them these mitzvahs. And we have this Jewish concept that it's like sending a package up to heaven. It sounds strange, but believe me, it really, there is a connection that you can maintain. And I'm going to tell a little story now that kind of illustrates this concept in a very personal way, that we can maintain a spiritual connection with our departed loved ones, and that they know what's going on down here in this world. So this story is called The Appraisal on My Mother-in-Law's Yard Site. So a few years ago, I was trying to cut the budget in several areas of our personal budget at home, and I had changed jobs, and I wanted to try and cut different things as much as I could. And one of the biggest things, obviously, in a personal budget is your mortgage, right? So we had bought our house not near the height of the market, but near the height. And so the price of our house compared to the neighbors was unfortunately a little bit, the wrong direction. So, but mortgage rates were coming down, and I thought if we could refinance, then we could save a few $100s per month, and that would really help a lot. So I called I called the banks and got some information, and they said, well, you'll have to do an appraisal. So I was kind of annoyed that I would have to go through that process, but it was a winter break, and I got my kids involved, and we decluttered the house and straightened everything up, planted flowers in the front yard. And I was very nervous because we really needed to go up in value quite a bit to be able to get this really good mortgage rate. And when I was making the appointment with the appraiser, he said, well, I'm going to come on such and such date. And I looked at the calendar and I saw that it was my mother-in-law's yard site. And my mother-in-law was a real estate agent in the end of her life. Like when she was about 70 years old, she decided she wanted to become a real estate agent. And, she was just such a personal person. She would just talk to everybody in the grocery store, the postman, the milkman, everybody. And she would just say, oh, my son is the greatest thing ever. And my daughter-in-law is so great. And so when my husband lit the yard site candle for her yard site, I said to my husband, I bet your mom is going to be here, and her flame, her soul is going to chase that appraiser around the house, and she's going to put into his head, you better give my son and daughter-in-law a really good appraisal. And so we were on pins and needles, and the appraiser knocks on the door, and he comes in, and we had prepared the house for 2 weeks, cleaned it up, straightened it up. And he was in and out of our house in 25 minutes. And I thought, oh no, oh my goodness, are we going to get the right appraisal? So we were on pins and needles. And I think about 2 or 3 days later, we get the news that we'd gotten the appraisal. And it was even more, actually, more than we could have imagined. And so we got the good rate and the better mortgage payment. So I know it's a silly little story, but it just goes to show you that they know what's going on. Our departed loved ones know what's going on. And, I don't know if she was really doing something for us, but it sure looked like it anyway to us. So that's why it's customary to do these Jewish practices. And we might feel like, we've lost someone, and, why did this happen? But when we lose someone, it makes us also question, what's my life all about? What's my mission? What am I here for? And this is what we're going through right now on a worldwide basis. All of us together, we're in this journey of tremendous loss. And we ask ourselves, what am I here for? What's my mission? What am I here for? What good things can I do in the world? How do I want to schedule my time? What can I do with my strengths? What are my weaknesses that I can work on? And it helps us feel empowered to do something to assess our situation, to assess our life, because life in this world is, 120 years if we're lucky, but it's not the end. So imagine that, they have a toddler, becomes a child, becomes a teenager, an adult, and then it's the next world, the afterlife. It's not like life ends at this world. No, it keeps going into the next world for eternity. And we have a fundamental belief in reincarnation. So we probably, all of us on this Zoom call, are reincarnated souls. We probably have all come back because there's something that we had to fix. We don't really know what it is that we have to fix, but we might have a glimpse of probably what it is, maybe a weakness that we have to work on. And that's why we come back. God sort of recycles the soul. So we have to come back and fix whatever it is that we didn't fix in a previous lifetime. And we're near the end, hopefully, of all these this cycling of souls. But apparently, we're near the end when eventually we'll have the final redemption. So the next story that I'm going to share with you is a little spooky, but it has a message that the soul does know what's going on. Okay. So because I give these talks all over the place, people will call me and they'll say, I want to tell you my story. And I'm sure many of you on this Zoom have a story that you could share too. And maybe at the end you'll share. But I got a call a few weeks ago from a rabbi in the central part of the United States. And actually his wife called me, and his wife said, I want my husband to tell you a story about his experience. And I said, sure. And she goes, well, you have to sit down for this story. I said, okay. So I was sitting down, and the rabbi came on the line, and he's in his mid to late 70s. And he said that in the beginning of his career, he went to a very small town where there weren't many there was hardly any Jewish institutions at all set up in the small town. And he had to pretty much set it all up. And he had to do a tahara, which is preparing a man for being buried. And he goes into the room, into the morgue, and he sees the body, and he's getting, ready to prepare him, because there's, gently washing and then putting him into the aron, the box to be buried. And he has a problem, and he doesn't know what to do. And it's quite strange. Okay. The man who had passed away, his arm was like up like this. Okay. Now, when someone passes away and the soul leaves, the body becomes very heavy and stiff. And he couldn't put the arm down to fit into the box. So this young rabbi doesn't know what to do. So he calls another rabbi for advice and counsel. And the other rabbi lived about an hour away. And he says, okay, I'll be right there. I'm like, okay. So he drives over, he's there in an hour. And I'm not joking, okay, when he says this. He says to the man in Yiddish, and I don't know how to speak Yiddish, but he says to the man in Yiddish, put your arm down. It's not respectful to have your arm up. You don't fit into the box. Put your arm down. He says this, he's practically screaming at the man in Yiddish. And the rabbi sees that the arm goes down. It goes down. Okay. So, I couldn't believe the story, but this man is very respected, and I have to believe him. So he said the arm went down. The soul heard and put his arm down, and he could fit. So that's a little crazy story that I wanted to share about the soul knowing what's going on. The next story I want to share with you has to do with like the future and the future generations, and knowing and having a sense of comfort that burying someone in a cemetery, that there will be future generations that will visit. And that's why it's important to visit. Some people go on a birthday, some people go on, different times of the year. And this story that I'm going to share with you is called Plotting a Future Marriage. And this story is personal in my life. My husband was born in Arizona. I was born in California, but I grew up, as I said, also all over the place, Australia, Malaysia, and England. And when my husband's mother was to be buried, she wanted to be buried near her mother and her grandparents. And that's in New York, the New York, New Jersey area. So we made a trip after she had passed a few years later, and we go to this cemetery in New Jersey. And I happened to call my mom, and I said, we're going to this cemetery, we're making this trip to New York, in addition to various other things we were going to do on this trip. And she said to me, my mother said to me, that cemetery sounds very familiar. I think my grandparents are buried there as well. And I said, really? That's so strange. There's like millions of Jews in New York area. And in the 1800s and 1900s, when all the Jews were coming from Russia and Poland and Lithuania, there's many, many cemeteries on the East Coast. So anyway, I thought, okay, I'll check it out. So we go to the cemetery and my husband pays his respects and he's, telling his mom about our life and everything and praying and getting very emotional. And I went into the office at the cemetery and I said, do you have any records going back many years of the Morshans and the Markowitzes? Those are my mother's grandparents. So they look in the back room, and it wasn't even computerized for those records. It was on paper. So they had to go back into different files. And they found indeed the record of the Morshans and the Markowitzes. And so after my husband was finished paying his respects to his mother, I pulled out the paper and I said, can we look? Do you have the energy? Do you have the time to go? Can we go look for these relatives? Because I'm sure in many, many years, no one's been here from that side of the family. So my husband looks at the map, the little map with has the directions of where the plots were. And he goes, oh, it's not hard at all. It's somewhere right around here. I'm like, really? And literally my great-great-grandparents were buried 20 steps from my husband's whole family. And not just his mother, but his mother, his grandfather, uncles, aunts, everything. And then on my side, there were a whole slew of aunts and uncles and grandparents. So if you can imagine that 100 years ago, and even more in some cases, my family and my husband's family were standing on the same soil, and they were paying respects, and they were comforting each other, and they were mourning the loss of their departed loved ones. And yet, 100 or so more years later, here our two families were united. So we call that story plotting a future marriage. And the amazing thing about this too is that I brought my little baby at the time, my little Haya. She was about 4 months old, and I brought her to the cemetery and I placed her. She was in one of those little carry-on things. I put her down on the ground next to, for her great 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 grandmother Haya, who came from Lithuania, from Kovno, Lithuania, in 1905. And I mean, it's to see that connection. My great great grandmother Haya, she left for religious freedom, and she was probably persecuted in the pogroms, but she came to America. And if it wasn't for her and her strength, 4 or 5 generations later, I wouldn't exist, and her little namesake wouldn't exist. And so it just shows the beauty of having a burial site to visit, the beauty of the cemetery, that the neshama part of it hovers there and is there for centuries, forever. So I wanted to just share that personal family story with you. Quite often when I speak, people will ask me, why does someone die at a certain time? And we don't really know. We don't have the answer all the time for these questions. But one of our comforting solaces is that we're here to do a purpose. We have a mission. And there's a prayer that we say when we wake up in the morning. It's Moda Ani. Thank you, God, for putting my soul back into my body. And you're like, what do you mean putting my soul back into my body? Isn't my soul in my body? Yes, it is. But when we sleep, part of us, I think it's a 1/60th of us, actually dies. And so that's why we have the custom to wash our hands in the morning, to get off that tuma, for that sort of impurity from death. And so when we're woken up every morning, it's because God has given us a purpose, and that he's, thank you, God, that my soul that you put into me is pure, because we have a pure soul and we have good things to do. And God wants us to continue to do those things. People ask me, why did someone so pass away at that time? Part of our Jewish heritage believes that their mission was complete. And it's really hard to take that. It's really hard to listen to that. But in a way, it's also comforting to say, well, they finished their job in this world, and now we have a job to do to move them up. And the good deeds that we can do can move them up in the next world. So I have 2 more stories I'm going to share with you, and then we'll open it up for questions. This next story kind of shows how the soul in the next world can actually sometimes help us and protect us. So this story was told to me by a lady who recently got up sitting Shiva for her father, and her sister-in-law's mother had passed away. There's just so much loss right now. Um, and she had taken a trip to a place where there's multiple little like cottages, to get away. This was just, I think about 6 months ago. So yeah, about 6 months ago, she took this trip and she was in one of these cottages and she was having a dream. But sometimes there's that dream feeling, but you feel like you're awake, but you're not really awake. She had this sensation that her mother had come into the room and spoke to her and said, "Please wake up. The door is open. You need to get up. The front door is open. So and so, my little grandson could get out. You need to get up. The door is open." So she wasn't sure if it was like an encounter from her soul, from this soul, or if it was a dream. But indeed, she did wake up, and indeed, the door was open, and the little 2-year-old toddler was sort of running around in the room in the middle of the night, and just he'd crawled out of his crib. So that soul came back at that moment. We think, we're not sure, but we can imagine the soul came back to protect that little baby from getting out, because the door was open ajar, and the little toddler could have gone out, and there was a swimming pool in the area, and there was also a forest in the area, and who knows what could have happened. So thank God there was this sort of interaction, whether it was a dream or if the soul really came. But she says, I felt this presence, and I could see something and I could hear something, but she couldn't quite articulate, what it was. And so that soul came back in that moment to protect, we think, to protect this this family. So there's reasons that of things, we live in this technical world, and we have to have an understanding of everything, but we don't know exactly how Zoom works, but it works, right? We can see each other and hear each other, but we don't understand what's going on really, and maybe somebody on this call does know the technology behind it and the engineering. But it's the same with the afterlife, right? We don't know everything about it. We don't understand all the not technology, but we don't understand the mechanics of why God does what he does. But that's, why we say Baruch Dayan Emes, blessed is the true judge, because God has his reasons and God knows what he's doing. And that can also give us a sense of comfort and feel that God is in charge and he knows what's going on. And one day we will, when we go to the next world, we will have that understanding, hopefully, as well, that everything that God does is indeed for the best. So I'm going to end with this last story, and which kind of shows the power of charity, the power of prayer, and maybe even reincarnation. And it shows the power of the afterlife, and that I really do believe it's true. And there's many cultures that have similar experiences. It's not just Jewish. So you can go on the internet and you can see all these near-death experiences, and people say very similar things. They say about hovering above the body, being able to see things that they couldn't possibly see if they were really inside their body. And so whatever culture you are in, many cultures talk about going through a tunnel, meeting lost loved ones, a great light. And so this is a Jewish concept. This is a Jewish concept. And there's a doctor who, he's a neurologist, and he had many patients tell him that they had had these near-death experiences, and he didn't believe it. He just wrote it off completely. But then he actually had his own. He almost died and he had his own near-death experience, and it changed his whole life. And he wrote a book about it. I can't remember the name of the book, but he wrote a book about his near-death experience. And as a neurologist, he really could be taken very seriously. So, and then he had to sort of rewrite his career because he had blown off all the rest of the story, the patients. So this last story that I want to share with you is about, okay, let me tell you the story. So this story happened 10 years ago, and I happened to call my Aunt Myra, who lived in Las Vegas at the time. She still lives in Las Vegas. And I have many cousins and aunts and uncles, and I called my aunt just to say, hi, how are you? And she said, oh, are you calling because you heard the news? And I said, what news? And she said that Uncle Arnold had passed away just that morning. And I had no idea. I was just calling to say hi. And he was in his 80s. And I said, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. When's the funeral going to be? And she said, there isn't going to be a funeral. We're not religious like you guys, whatever, you know. And I'm like, what? You got to do a funeral. And I couldn't argue with her. It was in the moment. So, and I was in shock and she was in shock. So I hung up the phone and I called my cousins who were about my age, a little bit older. And I called my cousins and everyone's crying and such. And I said, you know, we have to bury your dad. And they didn't know what to do. They didn't have much of a background. Actually, didn't have any background at all in Judaism. And so my uncle lay in the morgue for 2 weeks. And I was asking and begging and calling. And I was praying and praying and praying, please bury my uncle. And then I decided I got to give some tzedakah. I got to do something. I can't just like be calling and nothing's happening. So the first thing I did first though, actually, is I called the cemetery and I called the mortuary in Las Vegas and I gave them my credit card and I said, please be on call just in case they change their mind to do a burial. But I had no power because I'm a niece in this relationship. So I decided I got to give some charity dollars. So I gave some tzedakah to an organization in Lakewood that studies Mishnayos when someone's passed away. And it's customary in Judaism to study Mishnayos for someone's departed soul. And if you rearrange the letters of Mishnayos, you get neshama. So I didn't tell my cousins I was doing this. Okay, they wouldn't, whatever. It just wouldn't make sense. So I just went ahead and did it. I gave $180 for Mishnayos to be studied for my uncle's neshama. I did that on a Tuesday. Fast forward, I'm calling my cousins again, please bury your dad. And my cousin Valerie, who was in charge, said, okay, I agree. I'm like, what? You agreed? So she agreed. So I flew into Las Vegas. And at the cemetery, when we were burying her dad, my uncle, my aunt says, this is your calling. God is going to repay you. Like, that is so weird. Why would my Auntie Myra say that, you know, at a cemetery? Such a weird thing to say. So anyway, after the funeral, everybody's hungry. Okay, so we go out to a kosher restaurant. This is what it is. And we're sitting down with my cousin. And I said, Valerie, what changed your mind? You know, like I was calling you, I was begging you, I was praying. What changed your mind? And she said, I had a dream. My father came to me in a dream and he said, get me out of here. Get me out of here. I'm like, oh my gosh, Valerie, when was that dream? What? And she says, it was Tuesday night. And I said, which Tuesday night? She said, it was just this Tuesday night. And I said, oh my gosh. So that's when I told her, I said, I gave charity for your dad, for his soul on Tuesday morning. So she starts crying. I start crying. We're sitting there. We look like a wreck in the restaurant. And because we realized the magnitude of what just happened between the two of us and her father. And then fast forward, it gets a little better. A few months later, it's very, very hot in Arizona in the summer. And we decided to make a car trip to Colorado to visit Valerie and her sister who live in Denver. Even though her father lived in Las Vegas, my cousins lived in Denver, Colorado, and it's much cooler there in the summer. So we're about to get in the car and it's a 14-hour car ride. And I wasn't feeling so good. I had like that nauseous feeling. And my youngest child at the time was 6. And I thought, oh my goodness, this can't be. But I thought, I think I might be pregnant. I better get a test before we go on this car ride for 14 hours. So I get one of those little, tests, and it was pink. Oh my gosh, it was pink. I'm freaking out. I show it to my husband, and my husband's like jumping up and down. You know, he's 48 or so at the time. I can't remember. And he's 49. And he says, amazing, fantastic. I'm like, are you crazy? I'm gonna have a baby at 45. This is insane. So fast forward, we go to the doctor and everything's fine. And before that, I'm in the car and I'm thinking, gosh, I'm gonna have a baby. When is this baby due? And I'm counting on my fingers, when this potential baby's gonna be. And I realize, and it just flies through my mind, what my Aunt Myra said at the funeral. She said, this is your calling, God is gonna repay you. And I knew I was gonna be due like somewhere near when my Uncle Arnold had passed. And I thought, oh my gosh. So we go to the doctor for a checkup. Everything's fine. Go for the ultrasound a few months later, find out it's a boy. And I call my cousins from the ultrasound room and I tell them, I'm going to name this baby after your dad. So they were just so thrilled. And it just brought us so close together. But it gets even crazier. So remember, I told you how my uncle was in the morgue for 2 weeks because they couldn't decide what to do. So my baby was 2 weeks late. And the doctor said, if you don't get this baby moving, we're going to have to induce. And thank God the baby decided to come. And he came on Shushan Purim, the exact 1-year anniversary yard site of my Uncle Arnold passing. So we call my little boy Azriel Mordechai, my Shushan Purim miracle baby boy, born on my Uncle Arnold's yard site. So that story to me is why I tell these stories, why I tell everybody that there is something out there, there is an afterlife. We don't understand it fully, but we can maintain a spiritual connection with our departed loved ones. They know what's going on. We can do good deeds in their merit, and we can have comfort and solace that this is the way God designed the world, and this is how it is. And I don't know if my little boy is a reincarnation of my Uncle Arnold. My cousins, they kind of joke about it, but my little boy is a blondie, and my Uncle Arnold was like dark and 6'2", so they don't look at all alike. But we like to think that there's definitely a deep spiritual connection between our families because of this. So with that, I'd like to end, and I would like to open it up to any questions that anybody might have. You can.
I want to thank you, Robin. I'm going to interject with one little point, if you don't mind, because I just want to give a different definition to a word you used that I think will make it a little bit more meaningful. And that is, you translated tuma as impurity. And I think that can be a very negative connotation when we look at death and thinking of it as being something impure. And you mentioned that when we wake up in the morning, we wash our hands to wash away the tuma, the impurity, because sleep is 1/60th of death. Of a better translation, I'd like to share it with you. The word tuma, and I saw this, it was highlighted to me when I was in university at UCLA. I attended a course called The Anatomy of Death, which was for people going into the people helping professions. And we used to joke around, it was a killer course, but one of the things that we had to do, we had to go into the morgue of the UCLA Dental School. It was a very difficult experience. But one thing that struck me was when I saw these bodies who had donated their bodies to science lying there, I didn't see the neshama. I just saw a body. And we have to remind ourselves that our bodies are a vessel for the who we are. And that's what we're nourishing, the sap within us. It's going to flower and blossom. And whether we're going to be known as, we're known for our roots or known for our fruits, that's up to how we lead our life. Yeah. But one thing that I noticed is that the bodies were unable to express themselves on any way. They weren't able to say to me who they wore, what they liked on their pizza, what type of music they enjoyed, what made them happy, what made them feel uplifted and perhaps spiritual. They weren't able to express on any level. A better translation for tuma than impurity is blockage. A dead body is blocked from its opportunities to express itself emotionally, intellectually, physically, and beautiful. In this world, spiritually. And that's why when a person leaves this world, they're called niftar, they're pator. They're now exempt from the opportunities of elevating themselves in this world. Once a person leaves this world, they can no longer elevate themselves. We can elevate their neshama by the actions we carry out in their merit. But there is a blockage. Now, it's even more fascinating because if we look at the word tuma and we turn the letters around, it spells atum. Atum means blocked. Like in Israel, every home has to have a cheder atum, a sealed room, right? So atum means sealed or blocked. Tuma means blockage. It doesn't mean impurity. Conversely, purity is also a magnificent word. If we turn the letters around for the word which is translated as pure, right? Where we think of good or whatever. It really can be seen in the translation. Anybody in Israel who speaks a better Hebrew than me in the audience? The word, if you get the letters rahut, when we speak like rihita, it means when something just flows, it's fluid, it's fluent. So when we're in a situation of purity, life, all channels are open, all opportunities are open. And that's part of what we're nourishing in this world. So I just wanted to share that because I have a little pet peeve with that word impurity, but magnificent. Wow, your stories. But we'd like to hear from everybody here. So if anyone has questions or comments or perhaps even stories to share, we'd like to hear what you have to say.
Thank you. I'm definitely going to start using that. Tuma is blocked. Thank you so much.